This is Josh White with JW Math Tutoring, and this video is going to have part of my Improve Your ACT Math Score course in it, and that's specifically the section on the basics of using a TI-84 Plus model graphing calculator. So it's going to cover things such as the basic keys to press on the calculator, including how to copy down the last line, how to copy previous lines above that, how to get into different menus, and so forth. And then it will also go into graphing and some of the features related to graphing, including how to zoom in and zoom out, both by using the zoom button in the zoom menu, but also by using the window button and function as well. So if you have a graphing calculator, specifically a TI-84 model or even a TI-83, because most of the things are similar in that as well, but have never used it and never really done anything with it, this video is going to be a great introduction, to how to do some basic things on it and to familiarize yourself with it. And again, it's part of my Improve Your ACT Math Score course, which is now live on Teachable. It features over 10 hours of video instruction, covering many different topics such as strategies and techniques, obviously graphing calculator operations. There's a section on algebra review, also a section on reviewing geometry, and then the last section covers topics on probability and statistics, in addition to some miscellaneous topics as well. And in addition to all those videos, there's also a worksheet of practice problems, which are from old official release tests that you can complete at the end of each section, and then go watch the video solutions to those problems once you've completed them and worked them out. Also, if you like these videos, find them helpful, interesting, or entertaining, of course, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and sign up for notifications as well, so that whenever I post another math-related video, you'll find out right away. So let's go ahead and get to it.
But life is a dream that calculus could never predict.
Welcome to the second module of my Improve Your ACT Math Score course. This is an introductory module that will introduce you to some basic features on the TI-84 Plus graphing calculator, including basic keys that it features and operations, how to graph functions, and some of the operations related to graphing functions, such as zooming in and zooming out or adjusting the window size. So the purpose of this little mini section is to introduce those who have almost no familiarity with the graphing calculator to get comfortable with it. However, if you're already experienced with the graphing calculator and know how to graph functions on it and perform basic operations, then you can most likely skip this section and just go ahead to the main part of Module 2. But otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to go through and just talk about some of the common keys or buttons on the TI-84 Plus graphing calculator that you should be familiar with as you're going to start using it. So obviously, when you look around, you can see all the numbers are there at the bottom, and you have your operations, on the right side: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And you can see things like parentheses. You have arrow keys at the top, up, down, and left and right to move around. Then there's also an enter key at the bottom, which is what you hit just to execute basically an operation, or a calculation. And there's also, some other keys here, which we'll talk about on this slide, and also possibly on the next slide, and or in the main calculator operations section. So first key I just want to talk about is DEL, which stands for delete, at the top center here. So that's just used to delete a character. So whatever, you type a number, you type one thing too many times, you can just go over that character and then just press delete and it'll get rid of it. So it just has to be whatever highlighted over whatever character that you're trying to eliminate or erase. Also, one thing, just to the clear button, which is over here on the right, kind of below the arrow keys, you can just press that. That'll clear out or erase the entire line. So I'm going to clear out this whole first line. So I just hit clear, and now it's gone. Above the delete key, there are three letters in blue, INS. So first thing, just before I talk about that function, to access any of the operations which are in the light blue, above the keys, you just hit second. And then also, if you see, there's also some light green, letters above some of the keys. You can access those just by hitting the alpha button that's directly below second. So back to hitting second and delete. That will bring up INS, which is the insert function, and that's just used to insert a character and basically move everything over the way that you normally do on a say a computer or a phone when you're typing. Because the way the calculator is typically set up, if you type over an existing character, it just replaces it by default. It does not move it, to the right. It does not insert it. So if you're typing out some expression here, let's say whatever, 8 plus 9 squared, okay, plus 6 times 7 plus 4. And then you get to the end and you evaluate this, and I remembered, oh, I meant to type -8 at the front, not +8. So rather than having to, say, retype the entire thing, you can go back here, using the arrow keys, highlight the 8, and now we want to insert the negative sign, which is just down here next to the period. So I'll go ahead, hit second and the delete key to make it insert. Notice how the cursor changed from like the black square that was blinking to now just kind of like an underscore that's blinking. That's the key. That's how you know that it's now in insert mode. And so now I can just put in the negative sign, and then you could just go ahead, and now evaluate this expression if you wanted to. So, and in addition to, say, needing to insert a character when maybe you forget to type something and you don't want to, retype the whole expression, the insert function also comes in very handy for one of the things I'm going to mention at the very end. Basically, like the entry function, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Next thing I want to talk about is the number pi. So you just hit second and the little caret thing here, and that'll give you pi on the screen. That's just the number 3.1416 approximately, used in calculating the circumference and area of a circle. The next button I just want to talk about is EE, and the way you access it is you hit second and then the comma button. Now, notice when it shows on the screen, it only shows as one E, even though on the calculator itself, it has two capital E's. And so this is just used for scientific notation. So for example, and we'll go into this in more depth, again, in the main calculator operation section, but, if you wanted to type 5 times 10 to the 6th, we would do 5, and then the EE function, and 6 right there. And that's the same as 5 times 10 to the 6th, and if you hit enter, obviously it just gives it in standard notation because that's the mode that my calculator is currently set up in. Next button I want to talk about is e to the x. So if you hit second and then hit the ln button, you should see there's a little light blue e to the x over it, and then this just gives you the number e, which is approximately 2.7183. It's one of those common defined numbers in math relating to basically exponential functions, exponential growth and decay. And then you could just evaluate e to whatever power it's being raised to, whether to the first or second, third, or to a even a negative exponent. You can just now type in the exponent and then evaluate it. Oh, it looks like, sorry, I had an error because I did not actually put an exponent in. There we go, e to the first. The next thing I want to mention is a lowercase I, which is used for complex and imaginary numbers. Again, we'll get into that in a lot more detail in the main part of the calculator operations module, but just so you know, you can type I by hitting second and then the period button here at the bottom between 0 and the negative sign, and you can see when you do that there's a little lowercase I there. Now, I mentioned this function earlier. It's called entry, and the way you get it is you hit the second button, and then enter. And what this does is it copies down previous expressions that you've typed in on the calculator. And it will not only do the last line, it'll go back, basically as far as whatever's stored in the memory. So this is extremely useful because you can just copy the last line down, and then if you need to change like one number or like one or two characters on it, then you can just go ahead and change those rather than having to retype the whole thing. So that's where I was saying, like, in the insert function is really useful when you use it in conjunction with this. So it's like you're going through a problem on the test and you're trying to evaluate some function for a bunch of the different answer choices. So you type it in for the first answer choice, which is like -2, and you hit enter and you find out, okay, that's not right, so we'll move on to the next one. So you just use the entry function, copy down the last line, but now you want to check it for +2. So, okay, you could go in and you could just delete all the negative signs in front of the 2's, hit enter, find out that the answer is not correct. Okay, next answer to check is -1. So now you, again, use the entry function, copy down the last line. Now you have to change all the +2's to -1's. So you have to change the 2 to the 1, but you also have to insert the negative sign. And here's where you'd use the insert function. So just to show you an example, you hit second and enter. Okay, e to the first, the last thing I typed. If I do it again, there's technically the e with the blank exponent I didn't fill in. Okay, before that, you can see it was the 5 times 10 to the 6th in scientific notation. Before that, it was that long expression, where I inserted the negative sign. And it looks like that's going to be just as far as it goes because I just loaded the calculator before this. The last basic function that I'd like to talk about and spend some time looking at is ANS, or basically it refers to answer. So the way you access it is you just hit second and then the minus key, at the bottom, basically between the period and enter. And what it does is it copies down the most recent number or answer, that's basically what it's short for, from the last line. And this is extremely useful because if you're doing some type of multi-step calculation, you can use the number that was just calculated on the last line and not have to worry about, retyping it or rounding it or typing out all the decimal places. It'll just take the exact full value and use it in the next operation for you. And another thing just to be aware of with this is that if you type an operation, say without press typing any other numbers, it'll automatically fill in ANS, or answer from the last line for you. So just to show you what I mean by that is, let's just say, whatever, I'm going to do 9 divided by 2 plus 3, whatever, minus 4. Okay, and that's 3.5. Now, if I hit divided by or multiplied or minus or plus, it'll automatically take that last number, which is a 3.5, and it'll put that in front of whatever operation I hit. So here I hit divided by, and then I'm just going to do whatever, divided by 2.14, and I get that number. And now if I want to take this number and say I wanted to multiply it by, whatever, 9 to the second. Then I could go ahead and do that. Again, it copied down the 1.63555 as evidenced by the ANS in front, and then it, multiplied it by whatever I typed into the calculator. Now, just to show you how this can be really useful in terms of retyping things. So let's say you're working on, a law of cosines problem. And in this particular problem, you have all the sides, okay? So the basic formula that you're going to type in is maybe, I don't know, 5 squared, plus 6 squared minus 4 squared. That's in the numerator. And then that's going to be divided by 2 times 5 times 6. Okay, so we go ahead and do this, and we get some decimal. Now, in this case, notice the decimal is actually not too bad. It doesn't go on forever. We could easily just retype it if we wanted to. But this decimal is now equal to, say, the cosine of the angle you're trying to find. So what you need to do then is you need to do the arc cosine or inverse cosine of that number. Now again, in this case, we could easily type a 0.75, but I'll just do another example and change it slightly where it'll be a much longer number. I'd rather just copy the value down using the ANS function, again by hitting second and then the negative sign, and that's what I'm taking the arc cosine of to give me my angle measure. Okay, now this comes back to notice 0.722734, so that's because most likely my calculator is currently in radians mode, not degrees mode. And I can just check that here. Yep, so if I go back to degree and select that, and that'll be coming up, again, radians and degrees will be coming up in the main calculator section of this course. But now let's just, if I did second and the entry, second plus enter to get the entry function, now I just redid it. Okay, now it gives me the 43.719, blah, blah, whatever degrees. Okay, so now let's just show you a better example. Let me go back. Okay, so now let's say I'm going to change some of these numbers. So I'm going to make this a 7 and also make this a 7. And let's see. Okay, notice here, now when I do it, I get just some long random decimal that doesn't basically that doesn't terminate. So the point is, now if you wanted to find the arc cosine of that, or inverse cosine of that, rather than having to type out 0.8285714,286, or rather than having to just round it and then possibly get an answer that is not exact or is slightly off, again, we can just do second and the negative sign and put the ANS function in there, and now it'll do the arc cosine of that exact value, to tell us what the number is, and we can get it exactly as, as precise as we want. So the answer function is very useful in terms of doing multi-step calculations and copying down, the last value that you calculated from the line above to use it in another operation on the calculator. Okay, now the next kind of basic or background operation I want to talk about is graphing a function. So to do this, it actually is generally not difficult at all. First thing you have to do is press y equals, and then that's going to take you to the graph screen. And then after that, you're basically just going to type in the function and press enter, and then press the graph button, and that's it. And then you should get a graph of it. A couple things to keep in mind before we do it though. First of all the functions must be in the form of like y equals. So that means for if it's a line, it has to technically be in slope-intercept form, or y equals mx plus b. If it is not a line, if it's some other type of, polynomial or whatever, it has to be solved for y equals and everything else on the other side, just because that's the way the calculator is set up. So now if I go to the screen, okay, notice I have here y1, y2, all the way down to y9 at the bottom. I already have two functions entered in here. I'm just going to clear those out and just, whatever, type in some new ones. So notice also on this calculator, and this is the TI-84 Plus, to the left of the y equals, okay, there are some colored boxes with arrows. And if you basically move over those boxes and say you press enter on them, you can change the color of basically whatever you're going to graph, of your function. If you just want to switch it from blue to whatever color instead. And down here, you can also change basically whether you're going to graph a linear inequality versus a line versus like a solid line or a dashed or dotted line. I'm just going to set this to a dashed regular, just solid line right now, then click OK and enter. If you have a TI-84, the setup is a little bit different. The TI-84 does not offer color, so it doesn't have the color option. It just has basically graphing the line, or graphing a function, which is the line, really the line option, versus an inequality, which has the same arrows pointing like to the upper right and bottom left. Again, how to do that, graphing inequalities with shading and all that stuff, that comes in the main calculator operations section. So now if I just want to graph a basic function, I'm going to move back over here to the right of the equal sign, and let's say I'm just going to graph, whatever, 2x minus 8. And so after I've done that, good thing just to hit enter just to make sure it's stored in. Notice that the equal sign now is highlighted. That's an indication that that specific function will be graphed. If I did not want to include it on the graph, I could move my cursor over top of it and I could hit enter, and now it's not highlighted, and now it would not graph it. But I do want to graph it, so I'm just going to go ahead and highlight it again, and now hit enter just to make sure it's stored in. So now to graph it, I'm just going to hit graph. And now you should see a nice graph of a line on your screen. It should look something similar to what I see on my screen. And in terms of zooming in or zooming out or changing the viewing window of the graph, that's going to be on the basically the very next section, the very next slide that we're going to look at and we're going to talk about. But for right now, you should now know just how to do the basics of graphing a function. Also, a couple other things just to mention as well. Obviously, you can graph multiple functions at the same time. If I want to graph another function here, actually, let me make this with a negative slope. And they'll have different colors, again, on the 84 Plus. So I'm just going to type this second one in. Notice this one's actually technically graphing as an inequality with the shading because I had it set up from a previous problem. So I'm just going to go over here, change it now using the arrow keys just to a standard line, and then go down to OK, enter, and now I'm just going to redraw the graph. And now I should see basically a blue line on one hand and a red line for the other function. And just the very last thing, again, here you can enter in all the different types of functions that I mentioned on the previous slide as well. You could enter in an exponential function by doing, e to the something. Maybe it's e to the x plus 1 or whatever it is. Or you could do something with the sine, cosine, or tangent, trigonometric function if you wanted to look at that, or something with a logarithm or an ln or whatever it is. You can enter, the point is you can enter in all the same functions that you use on the home screen to do calculations with on this graphing screen as well. The next topic I want to talk about related to graphing is the graphing settings, basically, that you use to view the functions that you graph. First one I'm going to talk about is basically zoom, specifically how to zoom in and zoom out and the different types of zoom that are available to adjust the viewing window of your functions that you graphed. And then on the next slide I'm going to talk about how to adjust the window settings, which is another way to change how the function looks. So there are many different ways that you can zoom in or zoom out, or basically zoom on your function. So on my calculator here, I still have the same two functions, basically two lines that I had previously. So I'm just going to go ahead and go back, and graph them again. These are the same lines that were on the last, basically the last slide. And so now to zoom, you just press the zoom button at the top here, and you can see there's a bunch of different options listed. The most common ones are going to be number 2, zoom in, number 3, zoom out, and then number 6, zoom standard. So number 2, zoom in, will just allow you to zoom in on the graph wherever you want. The default, when you hit enter and select it, will be starting at the origin, but if you don't want to zoom in there, maybe instead I want to zoom in kind of close to where these two lines are intersecting, I'll move the cursor down there and then hit enter. And you can see it's now redrawn the graph and given me, a kind of a better picture of that small section. Now, excuse me, I'm going to go ahead and set the zoom back to the standard settings that I used when I first graphed, which is basically x values from -10 to 10 and y values from -10 to +10. So the easy way to do that is go back to the zoom menu and just go to 6Z standard, and that'll just redraw it with what are basically the default settings for both your x and y values. And so now you see we have a picture which is very similar to when we first graphed these lines, on the last slide. And of course, you can also zoom out if you need to. So again, we just go to the zoom menu and then go down to option 3. And then just pick wherever you want to zoom out on. You could do it again on the origin, which is the default kind of starting point, or you could move your cursor to anywhere else, on the screen. So I'll just pick the origin. And now we've zoomed out, and just to use the arrows, so now it looks like, so in the viewing window, the x, the x values go from, it looks like -40 on the left to most likely +40 on the right. Yep, and then we could also just check the same thing for the y's. Just using the arrows, jump down. It looks like, again, same thing's going to be -40 to +40 as compared to the original values, which were -10 to +10. Okay, so those are just some of the common zoom options to use when you're trying to get a better picture of a graph, because maybe, again, you need to zoom in or zoom out to examine one specific location of it, or just to get a good idea of the general shape of it. There are, again, other zoom options on here, but these three are the most common that you're going to use, most of the time when you want to kind of reposition, the picture of your graph. So, as I just said, zooming in, zooming out, is one way to kind of reposition or adjust the viewing window of, your graph of your function or functions if you have multiple things on the screen. However, there is an alternate way to do this as well, and this is going into the window settings and adjusting the X-min and X-maxes there, and also the Y-min and Y-maxes as well. You can also adjust something too called the X scale and Y scale, which I'll talk about in a second. And so before I get into this and actually show you, how it works, I want to mention that so the window settings are helpful and easier to adjust rather than zooming, just because you can specify the specific values of X that you want, or specific values of Y that you want. So a lot of times it can be much easier to just go in and change the window settings when you're trying to get a good picture of a graph, rather than trying to zoom in or out, because the zoom in and out is going to kind of apply the same scale, whether it's a multiplier, zooming in or zooming out, to both the x and y's. But sometimes you don't need to do that. You may need to keep just the minimum x values of -10 to +10, but you may need to greatly increase or decrease, the range of y values, because the graph is like very tall, or like very narrow or very steep. So adjusting the window values basically allows you to do that in a much quicker and easier manner. Okay, so first, just to send this back to the standard, I'm going to go to zoom and then 6z standard just to kind of redraw my graph of my two lines. Okay, so now that I got that on the screen, so now I hit window and notice that I've got, again, x min -10, x max +10, x scale or x SCL is 1. That's basically like how much the value is between each tick mark that you see on the axis. And then the y min and y max are -10 to +10. The y scale or y SCL is also 1. And then you've got other things down here, your delta x and your trace step. Those are basically for like moving the cursor, what the difference is between like the different points when you move the cursor, whether you're just moving it freely or whether you're on one of the functions itself. But generally you don't need to worry a lot about changing those. It's mainly the x min, x max, and x scale, y scale that we're going to change. So for example, let's say I wanted to zoom out, but I didn't want to go all the way to -40 to +40 like it did when I zoomed out by default, on the last slide. So now if I just go ahead and change these values, the x -20 to 20, and I'll do the same for the y. Hit the graph button, it's going to, redraw the picture, and essentially it's going to be zoomed out, but it's not going to do it, it's not going to be zoomed out as far as just the standard, like, kind of default zoom out, settings that the calculator would choose. Okay, so now I also just want to show you one more specific example of using the window settings to get a good picture for a graph of what's going on. So first I'm going to go back to my y = screen. I'm going to clear out both of these graphs. And the function I'm going to graph, which I'm going to write on the screen here, is basically going to be y = -2x² + 4x + 200. Okay, it's going to be a parabola or a quadratic function, and it's going to open down. So go ahead and type that in. Then give it a second to graph. So notice I see one real steep line on the left side of the calculator. I see another real steep line on the right side of the calculator, but I don't see much else. So right now, with looks like the viewing window, that had from the last thing we were looking at, which was -20 to +20, I don't really have a good idea of what this function looks like. I need to zoom out somehow to be able to see it from a better perspective. See where the maximum, point occurs. So if I go to zoom, and let's say I go to 3, zoom out, and I'm going to move up here because I'm guessing that the maximum point is, because it opens down, so I'm guessing then that the maximum point is going to be, somewhere way above the origin. So I'll move up here, then hit enter, and it's going to zoom out. So now, again, I've got a little better picture of it, but it's still not quite showing me, where the maximum point is. So if I want to try to zoom out again, I'd have to maybe scroll up here again, hit enter. Okay, so now I can actually see where the maximum point is, but notice how narrow it is, how compressed it is. It's very difficult to tell anything from this graph. And the reason is because in order to zoom out to see where the maximum point is, which is like kind of right up here, if we go to the window, we'll see that, wow, it set the x min and x max, to negative 320 to positive 320, and the y min to negative 257, y max to, 382. So it looks like, I don't need x values that are that small and that large. I do need y values in that range because I got to capture, the very top of it. So I'm just going to change these x values now to something like maybe, negative 15 to positive 15. Sorry, that came up because I hit the subtraction sign by mistake instead of the negative sign. And I'm going to keep the y min and max the same. So now I'll go ahead and hit graph. And now you can see I have a much better, clearer picture of what the graph looks like. So now, if I wanted to find the maximum point, which is kind of like right up around here, or if I was, say, maybe asked to find either of the x-intercepts, now I can clearly see, well, one is kind of right around here, the other's right around here. There are, of course, calculator operations that you could use to find each of those, which are covered, in the main part of this section. But the point is, by adjusting the window settings, specifically like the x min and x max, y min and y max, a lot of times it's easier to get a nicer picture of a graph than just using zoom in and zoom out, kind of like the default zoom functions. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about is basically tracing a graph and also a thing called the table of values. You may have seen me do some of each of these already. I don't think I actually went into the table values, but I think I did some tracing of the graph. And so that's just when you press the trace button and then move the cursor along the graph, and it will give you, x and y values at different points. And you can see they change as I move to the left or move to the right. Also, if you go back to that window function here, if we go down to, let's say, the trace step, and I clear this out, and let's say I just make this 0.5. So now, if I go back to the graph, yes, notice now how each of the x values are either whole numbers or, the 0.5 values between the nearest whole number, like 12, 11 and a half, 11, 10 and a half, 10, 9 and a half, 9, 8 and a half, 8, 7 and a half, 7, 6 and a half, 6, so on. So you can adjust or change, how far apart you want the trace points to be. But tracing just allows you to get a rough idea of, the specific points that are located on a graph. Then the other thing that's related to this is the table of values. So if you press table, which is basically second plus a graph, this is a screen that will show you x and y values basically in table form. Now, the default for these are going to just be integers. And however, you can change basically the amount between each of the x values. And the way we would do that is we're going to go to the table set menu. So you hit second and window, and that brings up table set. And so see, there's a couple different things here. First of all, there's table start. Even though the table will go past the table start, wherever you set the table start, like minimum value. If you want to use the value function, which again, this is covered in the operations, calculator operations, section coming up. Basically, you need the table start value to be less than any number you want to evaluate the function for. So don't worry so much about that now. It'll make more sense once you get to the actual section where I show you how to evaluate a function, basically by using the value function. But the purpose of coming into this menu now is basically this, delta TBL right here. So let's just say I changed this to 0.5. Okay. Now if I go back to, sorry, not table set, if I go back to the table, okay, now notice how all the values are separated by 0.5, just like the trace value I had on the graph. Okay, so now in addition to the integers, you also have some decimals as well. And like I said, basically on the table set menu, the top thing here, the TBL start value, that's just where the table is going to start by default as well. So in addition to that value being important when it comes to evaluating a function, you can just set this as like the default starting value so that when you go to the table itself after graphing a function, whatever number is in here for table start, that's where it'll start you off. So if I put negative 25, then when I go to the table, it starts me at negative 25. The default value is 0, okay, because normally it wants to start you right at 0 in the middle. So this is another way that you can look up values, i.e. x and y points, that are on the function that you've graphed. Okay, so again, these are just some basic ways that you can find different values or different points, an x value paired with a y value, on the function itself. You've now completed the introduction section to using a graphing calculator, which covers the basics of how to operate the calculator, including graphing. Now you should go ahead and begin the second module of this course, which gets into all the calculator operations that you can use to help you solve problems on the math section of the ACT.